I have walked through the shadowed corridors of the great palace of Constantinople more times than I can count. Yet each time the air feels heavier, as though the very stones carry the burden of centuries of whispered sins. The mosaics on the walls shimmer in the torchlight, images of emperors and empresses with solemn, almost lifeless eyes. They do not speak, yet their silent gazes seem to judge me, as if they know that I am here not to praise their glory, but to uncover what they desperately tried to conceal. You see, the history of Byzantium is not merely the tale of emperors, battles, and divine coronations. Beneath the golden domes and jeweled crowns lurked a truth so disturbing that even the most loyal chroniclers hesitated to put it to parchment. I speak of the marriages that defied not only the laws of the church, but the very laws of nature. Incestuous unions, sealed not out of love, but out of cold, calculating ambition. The imperial bloodline was considered sacred, almost God-touched. To dilute it with the blood of commoners was a sin far greater, in their eyes, than to wed one's own kin. And so, cousins wed cousins, uncles took nieces as brides, and brothers looked upon sisters with the approval of the court. All was justified under the banner of preserving the purple-born legacy, the porphyrogenitos, those born in the sacred porphyry chamber of the palace. My journey into these dark truths began with a single parchment I found in the archives of the Patriarchate. It was brittle, the ink faded to a deep brown, but the words were still legible. It was a letter, and signed, written by a monk who claimed to have witnessed a wedding ceremony that should never have been allowed. He wrote of a young emperor who took as his bride not a foreign princess, but his own niece, a girl barely past childhood. The monk wrote in trembling words, "The court celebrated as though God himself blessed the union, yet I saw the eyes of the saints in the icons darken." As I read further into the chronicles, the names began to emerge. The most infamous, perhaps, was Emperor Constantine VIII, whose daughters were married off to close kin under the guise of strengthening the family's hold on the throne. But this was no isolated case. The Macedonian dynasty was notorious for keeping its power tightly bound within a web of familial unions. Every wedding was another strand in that web, drawing the imperial line tighter around itself, yet also poisoning it from within. Whispers in the court told of strange children born to these unions, children who were frail, plagued by illness, or possessed of strange tempers. Some said it was divine punishment. Others claimed it was the price of greatness. But no one dared speak openly, for to question the emperor's marriage was to question God's will. It was not only about preserving blood, it was about controlling loyalty. A husband bound by marriage to his cousin would think twice before betraying her father, who was also his uncle. Families were welded into a single political entity, where betrayal was treason not just against the state, but against one's own flesh. And in a city like Constantinople, where conspiracies bloomed like weeds in the palace gardens, that kind of control was worth any moral cost. But such arrangements bred their own poison. Resentment festered. Women, often little more than pawns, were forced into unions that trapped them for life. Some became silent and obedient, living shadows in the palace corridors. Others learned to weave plots of their own, seducing, bribing, and manipulating to secure their position or avenge their suffering. I remember one particular tale that still chills my blood. It concerned an empress of the Komnenian era, whose name I will reveal later, for she will play a greater role in this story than you might expect. She was married to her first cousin, a man she despised for his cruelty. Yet the union had been ordained by the emperor himself, her uncle, who believed that keeping the fortune and lands within the family was worth any personal misery she might endure. This empress, trapped in a loveless and degrading marriage, began to keep a secret ledger of the wrongs done to her. Each page of that ledger, it is said, was written in her own blood. These are not the tales you will find in the polished histories written for the eyes of foreign courts. Those speak of unity, stability, and divine blessing. But I have seen the darker side of the imperial throne. I have seen the broken alliances, the brothers who poisoned brothers, the sisters who whispered treason into the ears of foreign ambassadors, all while the patriarch himself turned a blind eye to the marriages that broke every sacred law. What I have begun to uncover is not merely a pattern of incestuous unions, but a chain of conspiracies, plots that stretched across generations, hidden beneath the veil of family loyalty. The marriage bed became the battlefield, and the cradle became the throne's most dangerous weapon. And yet, I am only at the threshold of this labyrinth. Behind each union lies another secret, another betrayal. Some of these truths were buried in the vaults of the great palace. Others were hidden in monasteries far from the capital, entrusted to monks who feared for their lives if their knowledge ever came to light. Now, as I prepare to reveal the first of these great scandals, I feel the weight of the city pressing upon me. The streets of Constantinople are alive with noise, the cries of merchants in the marketplace, the clang of the bronze gates, the endless murmur of the sea against the walls. Yet beneath it all, there is a silence that has lasted for centuries. It is the silence of the dead, the silence of those whose stories were never meant to be told. I intend to break that silence. The first great scandal I will lay bare for you begins in the year when Emperor Romanos II still reigned, and the golden court of Constantinople glittered with festivals, processions, and banquets. On the surface, the empire basked in triumphs, its armies victorious in the east, its treasuries swollen with the spoils of war. But within the palace walls, behind the marble colonnades and silk curtains, a marriage was being arranged that would seal not peace, but tragedy. Her name was Theodora Porphyrogenita, a princess born in the sacred porphyry chamber, daughter of an emperor and niece to another. She was as much a symbol as she was a living woman, a reminder that the blood in her veins was imperial and therefore untouchable by any man not of her station. Yet the court was restless. Romanos feared the ambitions of distant noble houses, and his advisors whispered that to marry Theodora to a foreign prince would be to invite a stranger's claim upon the throne. The solution they proposed was one of the oldest and most poisonous in Byzantine tradition: marry her to family. The chosen groom was none other than her cousin, Michael, son of her father's brother. The union was justified before the patriarch as a divine act to preserve the unity of the purple. The church hesitated, its canons forbade such close unions, but the emperor's will was law, and the patriarch soon found himself speaking of God's mysterious ways during the wedding liturgy. I have read the accounts of those who attended the ceremony. They described the great hall ablaze with candles, the scent of frankincense heavy in the air, the sound of the choir echoing like the voices of angels. Yet among the guests, there was an unease, a tension that made smiles stiff and conversations guarded. For they knew that Michael was a man of cruel temperament, prone to drunken fits and sudden rages, and that Theodora despised him even before she was forced to take his hand. The marriage, as many feared, became a slow-burning war. Theodora, though outwardly obedient, began to weave alliances within the women's quarters of the palace. She befriended eunuchs, ladies-in-waiting, and even kitchen servants, using each as a pair of eyes and ears. Michael, meanwhile, sank deeper into paranoia, convinced that his wife sought to undermine him. The imperial couple dined together in public, but behind closed doors their voices rose in bitter argument. It was during this time that a strange rumor began to circulate through the court. Whispers claimed that Michael had fallen ill after a banquet, and that Theodora had been seen slipping away from the table moments before he began to choke. The official account spoke of spoiled meat, but one servant, whose confession I found in a monastery archive, claimed that the meat had been perfectly fine until a powder, pale and odorless, was sprinkled upon it. Michael survived that night, but his health began to wane in the months that followed. His once fiery temper gave way to lethargy. His body, once strong, grew gaunt. Theodora played the role of dutiful wife, sitting by his bed, feeding him broth, and ordering the physicians to try every cure known to the empire. But behind her calm gaze, some claimed to see satisfaction. The end came on a cold winter night. Michael was found lifeless in his chamber, his lips tinged with blue. Theodora wept publicly, tore her garments, and vowed to retire to a convent in mourning. But she did not. Within weeks, she was seen again in the court, her influence stronger than before. Some claimed that she had inherited Michael's estates, which greatly increased her wealth and power. Others whispered that her true prize was not land or gold, but freedom from a union she had loathed. And yet, the story does not end here. You see, the deeper I dug, the more I began to suspect that Theodora's marriage and Michael's death were only one piece of a far larger puzzle. There were patterns, marriages between cousins and uncles and nieces, unions that ended in sudden deaths, unexpected shifts in power, and the quiet rise of certain figures in the imperial court. It was as though a hidden hand had been shaping these events, guiding them towards an unseen goal. One clue came from an unlikely source. A letter written by a merchant from Trebizond who had supplied the palace with rare spices. In the letter, he spoke of an order placed by a lady of the court for a specific powder, said to come from the distant mountains of Armenia. The powder was described as having the power to end both suffering and breath. The merchant claimed he had delivered it in secrecy, disguised among jars of cinnamon and cloves. The date of the delivery matched almost exactly the month when Michael's health began to decline. Who this merchant's client truly was, I cannot say for certain. Yet the handwriting on the order bore a resemblance to one I had seen before, in the archives of the imperial treasury, signed by a high-ranking lady closely connected to Theodora. In Byzantium, no crime was ever committed by one hand alone. Every act had accomplices, those who supplied, those who concealed, and those who profited from the outcome. And in this case, it seemed that Theodora's liberation from her husband had been orchestrated by a network of allies who saw in her a useful pawn, perhaps even a future ruler. What chills me most is not the thought of poison or betrayal, but the realization that such acts were considered almost ordinary in the palace. The union of blood was sacred in name, but in truth it was a chain, and those bound by it learned quickly how to break it when the need arose. Theodora's tale is but the first of many, and as I turn the next page of this hidden history, I see the shadow of another woman, one whose marriage would plunge the empire into open conflict, and whose ambitions would make Theodora's seem almost tame. The story I now unfold is one that the official chroniclers disguised beneath layers of pious lies, for it shook the imperial court to its foundations. It begins during the reign of the Komnenian dynasty, when the empire was ruled not only by the strength of its armies, but by the cunning of its courtly intrigues. The central figure is Anna Komnene, niece to the emperor, famed in the court for her beauty and her ruthless wit. From her earliest years, she was groomed not for love, but for politics. Her mother, a stern and calculating woman, believed that marriage was a weapon sharper than any sword, and that Anna's hand could be used to weld two powerful branches of the Komnenoi into a single unbreakable chain of loyalty. Thus, Anna was given in marriage to her mother's brother's son, her own first cousin, Isaac. The union was celebrated in the Hagia Sophia with grandeur meant to impress both the citizens of Constantinople and foreign envoys. The patriarch intoned solemn blessings, the choir filled the vast dome with echoes of psalms, and the court marveled at the gold-threaded robes the couple wore. But beneath the gilded surface, trouble brewed. Isaac was a soldier, bred for the battlefield, but he had little patience for the endless ceremonies and intrigues of the palace. He viewed Anna not as an equal partner but as property, an extension of his household, a tool to display his status. Anna, who had been raised among women who ruled the inner court with an iron hand, chafed under such treatment. Within months, their marriage had turned cold. Isaac took mistresses openly, lavishing them with jewels and silks that Anna believed were hers by right. Anna retaliated not with tears, but with strategy. She began to cultivate alliances with key figures in the palace, the chief eunuch, the keeper of the imperial seal, and even certain ambitious bishops who saw in her a potential patron. Then came the moment that changed everything. The emperor, their shared uncle, fell gravely ill. With no legitimate sons, the question of succession loomed like a storm over the capital. Isaac, as a male of the imperial bloodline, was an obvious candidate. But Anna, too, was of the purple-born, and in Byzantium a clever and well-connected woman could wield power equal to any man, if she dared. According to a document I discovered in a monastery in Bithynia, Anna began to conspire with her mother and a group of loyal courtiers. Their plan was bold. Isaac would be crowned emperor, but his reign would be short. Once he was on the throne, Anna would use her influence to remove him, whether by forcing him into monastic exile or by more final means, and claim the regency for herself, ruling in the name of a young cousin who would serve as a figurehead. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The emperor died suddenly, and Isaac was indeed crowned amid cheers in the hippodrome. But within weeks, rumors spread that Anna had been seen visiting the imperial kitchens late at night, speaking in hushed tones with the master cook. This, in itself, might mean nothing, until one recalls how many Byzantine rulers met their end through the contents of a goblet or a dish of roasted meat. The chronicles tell us that Isaac fell ill after a banquet celebrating a minor military victory. His decline was swift and brutal. Fever consumed him. His skin turned an unnatural yellow, and his mind wandered into delirium. Physicians were summoned, prayers were offered, relics were brought to his bedside, but nothing availed. Isaac died within 10 days of his first symptoms. Officially, the court mourned. Anna wore black and wept at the funeral, but not all were deceived. Several courtiers disappeared in the weeks that followed, men and women who had been close to Anna during her husband's reign. Some were sent to distant monasteries, others simply vanished. The implication was clear. Those who knew too much had been silenced. What makes this episode more chilling is that Anna did not achieve her goal. The regency she sought slipped from her grasp when another branch of the Komnenoi seized control of the palace guard and installed their own candidate upon the throne. Anna was spared exile, but her influence was broken, at least for a time. And yet, her story reveals much about the nature of incestuous marriages in Byzantium. They were not merely unions of blood, but battlegrounds where ambition, resentment, and betrayal flourished. When cousins wed, they did not simply share a bed. They shared a claim to the same throne, and that was a recipe for treachery as deadly as any foreign invasion. The archives suggest that Anna lived out her remaining years in a kind of quiet watchfulness, never fully trusted, but never entirely without influence. She is mentioned in letters as a patron of certain monasteries, which may have served as safe havens for those still loyal to her. Some even claim that she continued to orchestrate intrigues from the shadows, waiting for the day when the imperial family would once again tear itself apart and offer her an opening. Her marriage and its bloody end became a cautionary tale whispered in the women's quarters of the palace. Yet it also set a precedent, for not long after, another union between close kin would ignite a crisis far greater than the death of a single emperor. This next scandal would not be confined to palace corridors. It would spill into the streets of Constantinople itself, drawing the city into open conflict and threatening to split the empire in two. The scandal I now recount is perhaps the most dangerous of all, for it did not remain locked within the marble halls of the great palace. It spilled into the streets of Constantinople, igniting riots and bloodshed that threatened to tear the empire apart. It began in the reign of Emperor Andronikos I, a man both feared and admired, whose life was a tapestry woven of war, charm, cruelty, and desire. Andronikos was a seducer, and his appetites were notorious, not merely for their number, but for their disregard of law, morality, or even common sense. When Andronikos seized the throne, he was already the scandal of Europe, having seduced noblewomen in the courts of both the East and West. But the union that would plunge the capital into chaos was not merely immoral by the Church's standards. It was a direct affront to the Byzantine people themselves. The bride was Anna Komnene Angelina, his own niece by marriage, the daughter of his cousin. She was barely past childhood, golden-haired and delicate, a figure who inspired pity even in the hardened soldiers of the palace guard. Andronikos, nearly 60 at the time, decided to take her as his wife. The wedding was held in Hagia Sophia under heavy guard. The patriarch, pressured by the emperor's presence and the glittering ranks of the court, gave the blessing with a voice that trembled so slightly that only those standing closest could hear. Outside, the people of Constantinople muttered their discontent. This was not simply another imperial marriage of close kin. It was the emperor himself taking a child from his own family to bed. At first, Andronikos dismissed the murmurs as the jealousy of lesser men. He was, after all, a ruler who had survived assassination attempts, exile, and rebellion. But the discontent grew. The capital was a city of gossip, and the markets rang with whispers of the emperor's depravity. Monks preached in hushed tones of the curse that awaited those who defiled God's laws. Pamphlets, Small scraps of parchment bearing crude drawings of the emperor and his young bride circulated in the taverns and docks. The breaking point came when a faction of the aristocracy, already weary of Andronikos' harsh rule, seized upon the scandal as their weapon. They began to spread a dangerous rumor that the marriage was not only sinful, but a sign of the emperor's madness, and that God himself had withdrawn his blessing from the empire. The timing was perfect, for famine had struck the city after a poor harvest, and the people were restless. One summer morning, the first riot erupted near the Forum of Constantine. It began as an angry crowd protesting the rising price of bread, but soon the chants turned to cries of "Shame on the emperor!" and "Banish the child bride." The guards tried to disperse them, but by nightfall, flames rose from the market stalls, and mobs roamed the streets. Andronikos responded as he always did, ruthlessly. He ordered the ringleaders seized and executed in the hippodrome. Their bodies were left hanging as a warning, but this only deepened the fury of the people. The unrest spread, and soon even some of the palace guards began to waver in their loyalty. I found, in the hidden archives of a monastery near Chalcedon, a letter from one of the court eunuchs describing the chaos within the palace during those days. He wrote of the young empress, pale and silent, moving like a shadow through the corridors, her eyes fixed always on the floor. She spoke little, ate little, and never smiled. Some whispered that she prayed constantly for deliverance, not from the rioters outside, but from the man who called himself her husband. The conspirators moved swiftly. Led by Isaac Angelos, a member of the imperial family with his own claim to the throne, they rallied both nobles and commoners to their side. The scandal of the marriage became the rallying cry, and the city, already seething from hunger and cruelty, rose in open rebellion. On the day the palace fell, the gates were thrown open from within. Andronikos tried to flee across the Bosphorus, but his boat was intercepted. He was dragged back to the city in chains, the mob howling for his blood. I will not describe in detail the fate that awaited him. Suffice it to say it was one of the most brutal deaths ever inflicted upon an emperor, his body torn apart in the streets by the very people who had once cheered his coronation. As for the young empress, she vanished from the chronicles. Some say she was placed in a convent under a new name. Others claim she died within the palace before the end, a victim of poison to spare her the horrors of the siege. Her fate remains one of the many unsolved mysteries of the Byzantine court. And so the final scandal in this chain of incestuous unions ended not in whispers, but in the roar of a city aflame. It proved what I have come to believe after years of piecing together these hidden histories, that in Byzantium, the imperial bed was as dangerous as the battlefield, and that the blood spilled in the name of family was often more treacherous than that spilled against any foreign foe. I have told you now of Theodora and her poisoned marriage, of Anna and her crimson wedding, and of Andronikos' fatal union. These are but fragments of a greater truth, a truth that the polished histories still dare not speak. For in Byzantium, the purple was not only the color of imperial robes. It was also the color of blood, shed within the family to keep the crown from ever leaving it.